Is it the 14th on the case of Derek Chauvin? Welcome, everyone, to Socialist Action's Zoom webinar today. We have a couple of speakers. One may be late. Our first speaker is Michelle Gross. She's the president of Communities United Against Police Brutality in Minneapolis. The technical matters are going to be handled by Minnesota human rights activist, Minneapolis activist Lisa Leonard. And I am Jeff Mackler. I'm the National Secretary of Socialist Action, and I'm the director for the past 35 years of the mobilization to free Mumia Abu Jamal. Tragically, I just got off a phone call. Mumia is scheduled for heart surgery, and we're hoping the best and fighting to make sure that his own doctors get a chance to participate. Okay, our subject today is the classic case of Derek Chauvin. That is the police officer who for over 9 minutes had his knee on George Floyd's neck and murdered him. This is perhaps the most highly publicized trial in the modern era, with the New York Times featuring front page and continuing coverage of testimony virtually every day. And in the meantime, we have the horror of yet another Minneapolis police murder, this time in Brooklyn, Minneapolis, a suburb of the Twin Cities area, the murder of yet another innocent Black man at a traffic stop, which has caused demonstrations in the thousands. The Chauvin trial takes place under amazing conditions. 1,000 National Guard troops have been brought in to defend the proceedings, along with 1,000 police officers, barricades, wire mesh, all to protect the sanctity of the proceedings against Derek Chauvin. So let's begin now with Michelle Gross. We're pleased to have you and honored that you have been a lifelong activist in the struggle for democratic human rights and civil liberties in Minnesota. Michelle, let's begin.
Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's my pleasure to be here, and kind of want to just tell people a little bit about what it's like here. If you're not living here, it's almost hard to imagine how things have developed in this area. First of all, Jeff mentioned that we have over 1,000 National Guards in downtown Minneapolis, which is, not that big of a place. So it's pretty crazy to have all these like vehicles zooming around the streets constantly and all of these troops. And then our government buildings are all ringed in double layers of chain link fence with razor wire in between. So I've been calling them like the Berlin Walls around all of these buildings. And in downtown Minneapolis, we have this building, the Hennepin County Government Center. And the government center is where our courts are, but it's also where a lot of services are delivered to people. There's, people can get food assistance. They can, there's a large domestic abuse program that comes out of there. You go down there to renew your plates on your car, your driver's license. All kinds of services happen at the courts. But our court has the entire building, which is this huge 24-floor double tower building, has been shut down for the entirety of the Derek Chauvin trial. Nothing else, no other matters can happen in that building while this trial is going on, which is unbelievable to me because, we have murder trials in Minneapolis on a fairly routine basis, sadly. And so the idea of this entire government service center building being shut down for one trial of one killer cop is astounding. I call that part of what I call cop exceptionalism. Why would he need an entire, 24-foot double tower building shut down just so he can have a trial? It's amazing. The other thing that's really unusual about what's going on here, we've got a few other things going on. From the outset, the government here has attempted to frame the problem as protesters, like, we're the big problem. So that's why they've got all these National Guard people down there and all this stuff. And they're really trying to frame up all of this as like we have to control these protesters and all this. They also put out a contract that's worth over $1 million to hire these different so-called community groups. People like to call them the peace police or whatever, these types of community groups that really are just like an extension of the cops. And these community groups are getting $175,000 each to run around and pretend like they're valuable at protests or whatever, and to harass protesters. Just this past weekend on Sunday, when Dante Wright was killed, I was at the protest. I raced straight over there and met his parents and all of this. And we were having a protest out there, and our sound truck, we actually were in the middle of another protest on Sunday when this all came up, and we all rushed over there. And our sound truck was out there, and one of the chanters was, just chanting normal chants. And some of these peace police people went over there, and they didn't like the chants, even though they're not in Minneapolis. This is a suburb. Brooklyn Center is a suburb of Minneapolis. And it's probably about 12 or 14 miles away from Minneapolis. They're out there, and they are basically, they circled our speaker, disconnected the microphone, stood on the cord so it could not be reconnected. So in other words, their whole purpose is to try to control the free speech of, protesters, and then to also bolster the city's narrative that somehow the protesters are the problem, not the police violence that we protest. So, and this comes in the context of the fact that we have not had a single solitary change happen, by our city council or by our state government, not a single change in any laws, policies, or anything that would ensure that we don't have another George Floyd case occur. We not one single change have they made, but yet they're going to do all of this stuff to make it look like the protesters are the problem, not them, and not the police that that engage in this violence. So I think that that's really important for people to understand the kind of the context that we're operating under here in the Twin Cities. I've been doing this work for about 34 years, and I just don't think I've ever seen anything like it here in the Twin Cities. I really don't.
Well, let me ask you a question, a strange question. Here we have a nationally publicized trial of a killer cop based on not only unbelievable evidence by medical examiners, but by a video which shows the murder in progress, seen by virtually every juror and by millions of people across the country. And yet we see there's a debate with the police officers' organization spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, hiring 10 lawyers, all putting forward the traditional arguments that are used to say that the policeman should be let off scot-free. That's the norm in our society. If Derek Chauvin is convicted, he will be one of the perhaps 1,000 Black people who are attacked, if not 400 each year, slain, unarmed by cops with virtually zero convictions. Seems to me there's something fundamentally wrong with the system where we can justify it by perhaps convicting one person while tens of thousands of others suffer the racist injustice of police violence and the criminal justice system. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, I completely agree with your analysis. What people have to understand about Minnesota is that it's a pretty white state. It's about 85% white, but yet we have had since our organization started 20 years ago, we have had over 470 people killed by law enforcement in the state of Minnesota since 2000. So we really have a big problem with police killings in the state, and yet we have only had 4 prosecutions of officers for killing members of the community, 4 in the entire history of the state of Minnesota. The first was Geronimo Yanez, who killed Philando Castile. Then we had, and he got acquitted. Then we had another cop, Brian Crook, who killed a man named Benjamin Evans in the northern part of the state. He got acquitted. Then we had Mohammed Noor, who is a Somali man, and he happened to kill an affluent white woman in the kind of richy part of town, and he got convicted. Black cop killing white woman, right? Then on top of that, now we've got the Chauvin trial. So everybody's watching this trial with bated breath, because what is going to happen about the prosecution of a white cop killing an African-American man? This is like literally people around the world are tuning into this thing. And, not to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not convinced that we're going to get a conviction. We need to get a conviction. Everybody in the country saw that video, and everybody around the world saw that video. But it's not a for sure thing to me that we are going to get a conviction. And I want to say something else about that video. But for that video by the very brave Darnella Frazier, and I remember talking to her that very night that when that video was out, but for her making that video, but for that, we would probably still not know to this day what had killed George Floyd, because the way things are stacked up here, cops control all the information. They can continue to hang on to that information for as long as there's a ongoing investigation. And I put that in quotes, air quotes, because they use those for excuses. And I'm working with families now that it's been over a year, and they're still being told that they cannot get any evidence in these cases at all. And what they attempt to try to do is to toll out the statute of limitations, because we have one of the shortest statute of limitations in the country here for wrongful death lawsuits, and that's 3 years. And they try to, drag these investigations out, so-called, until these statute of limitations are nearly up. And so it's highly likely that had there not been that video by Darnella Frazier, George Floyd's family would still have no idea what had happened to him. And so that to me says a lot about the importance of community member videos. I just can't emphasize it enough. We teach Cop Watch here. We teach neighborhoods how to form Cop Watch groups. And we teach people how to do good quality videos that can be used in court if necessary. These videos are everything, because they're the data that the community controls that the cops don't control. And they are everything. I know I'm talking a long time. I want to throw one more piece in here about this whole matter. The night that video came out, couple interesting things happened. One is that while the video was all over Facebook, and people had texted me and said, "You got to get on Facebook and look at this video." I started looking at it. Right after that, police information officer John Elder came out of City Hall, stood on the side of City Hall to the media and said, "We had an arrest this evening in which the person experienced a medical emergency and died." That was the explanation the city gave of George Floyd. I'm hearing that on the television while I'm watching the video on my computer going, that is not a medical emergency. That is a murder. And I looked at that video and I realized that was Derek Chauvin. And I knew his face from prior bad acts that this guy's been involved in. We'd had a lot of cases where people had complained about this guy. And so I knew who he was. And then when one of the bystanders, who now turns out to be Donald Williams, said his badge number, I quickly looked at my badge number list and I said, yep, that is Derek Chauvin. And that allowed us to put his entire record up on Facebook within about an hour after that video had gone up. And so the community could get to know who this character was. And he's a very bad actor. He had 26 complaints. He had 4 prior deadly force incidents before he killed George Floyd. This is a guy that had no business of being on any police force anywhere. He's dirty. He's violent. And by the way, all 5 of his deadly force incidents involved people of color, all 5. He's a racist, but he was powerful in the police department, which is why they never got rid of him. And so I just wanted to point out the value of the community making our own videos and getting our own information and gathering it so that when we need it, we have it ready.
Thanks, Michelle. Of course, the Derek Chauvins exist in the context of a police department where virtually every officer follows the code of conduct of not revealing the truth. So the sum total of the evidence of murder, which takes place literally on a daily basis. I'm not using this as rhetoric. One Black person is murdered, innocent, unarmed, every day in the United States. And 99% of the time, there is no prosecution. I'm going to call on Lisa Leonard, a socialist action activist in the Minneapolis area who lives a block or two away from where all these events are taking place. She's written widely on the George Floyd case and Derek Chauvin. Lisa, give us some insight about what's happening with the trial, what your experience is with this criminal injustice system, and what the reaction is today to the murder of Daunte Wright.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. And thanks, Michelle, for being with us. Really glad to have you here. We're hoping that Mel Reeves will be able to join us for a few minutes tonight, but he's also very involved in the organizing that's going on, so he might not be able to join us, but we're hoping to have him join us for a future webinar. So yeah, I live very close to the 3rd Precinct Police Station in Minneapolis that was burned down last summer after George Floyd was killed. And so this has had a huge impact on my community, the community that I live in. I live in South Minneapolis, and it's a community where there's a lot of people who live in poverty. We have a lot of people experiencing homelessness. We have a lot of people of color. We have minorities. We have Native American people. We also have a lot of immigrants in my community. So this has had a really big impact on us. It's just, I would say it's been devastating. It's very painful. People are so angry. And like Michelle has laid out, this is not an isolated incident by far. This is something that's happened over and over and over again. And, you know, there have been, you know, police killings that have garnered attention in Minneapolis in the past. But nothing like the level of what we saw last year where, you know, the George Floyd's murder just sparked these massive protests that started in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but spread to the entire country and then around the world. And I think what that shows us is that it's not just about one or two bad cops, or this cop is racist, or we need to ban chokeholds, or whatever it might be. It's the system, it's the police system that's the problem. And people recognize that, and they're tired of it. And they're going into the streets to protest because they want things to change. And that's what I saw in my community, that people took this pain and this rage about what happened to George Floyd and turned it into all this positive action in the streets, even though the news loved to focus on the looting that happened in Minneapolis. Most of the protests were peaceful, and the same with the protests that happened across the rest of the United States. Most of those protests were very peaceful. And so, you know, it's really the system that's the issue here. And I think the murder now of Daunte Wright has just shown that so clearly that, you know, I think I read a quote from Ben Crump, the lawyer who represented George Floyd's family and now is representing Daunte Wright's family. And he was like, I was so shocked when this happened because I was expecting the police to be on their best behavior during the trial. The world is watching, and yet we have another murder of a Black person just a few miles from where George Floyd was murdered. And I think this really shows us that, you know, no matter what the outcome of the trial is, whether Derek Chauvin is acquitted or whether he's convicted, we need to keep protesting. We need to keep going in the streets. We need to keep doing the work because the system is still going to be there. It's still going to be in place.
Thanks, Lisa. I want to urge our listeners to click on our Socialist Action YouTube and be a subscriber. Check out our website at socialistaction.org. and let us know if you're interested in a revolutionary socialist party. We say this: when Lisa and Michelle referred to the protests last summer, they were the largest protests in the history of the United States. We had an estimated 16 to 26 million people in 2,000 cities marching in solidarity with the Minneapolis with the Minneapolis fight back against the racist police murder of George Floyd. It happened at a time where it seemed like the Breonna Taylors and Eric Garners and murder assassinations across the country were for the first time being understood by everyone, especially when some 20 million people mobilized. And they were initiated by the Black community, but joined in by millions of white youth who understood that there's something fundamentally wrong with a school to prison industrial complex that leaves the United States rating #1 in the world with a number and percentage of its population in prison, the majority Black, Latino, and Native American. So I think we're looking at a reckoning, and I agree. We have some questions. Karen and John sent in a question saying they were curious if there's anything happening at the trial that was surprising, that was new and different. And yet another question that asks whether or not the record of Amy Klobuchar, her history regarding covering up cop killings, has been brought to the attention of the general public. For a while, Klobuchar was among the secondary presidential primary Democratic Party primary participants. Michelle, Lisa, what's your comment?
Well, I'd love to talk about that for a second. A couple of things. The only thing that surprised me so far, frankly, in the trial is that the prosecution has done a little bit better job than I expected them to. The special prosecution team that was selected by the state included all of these sort of like lawyers that were really taking the positions because it's almost like a kind of a glory thing or something. So they had like a product liability lawyer from Medtronic and some contract lawyer for some big law firm or something. And I was thinking to myself, none of these people sue cops on a regular basis, so they're not going to have any idea what they're doing. And in fact, some of the attorneys that I work with and that I know who do regularly sue the cops and who have worked around policing issues have been pretty, they were pretty concerned about the quality of the lawyering in this case. And I think it's actually been a little bit better than I expected. So probably that's the one thing that has been a little surprising to me is that it's not as much of a disaster in the prosecution.
I think our system froze up for a moment and we've lost Michelle. Can we get her back?
And, as much as I really wanted there to be a conviction in that case, what ended up happening was bad jury selection. And, I literally was like watching a slow motion train wreck because the juries matter a lot. And the prosecution was letting all these jury members on that were like ridiculous. One woman was said, "Oh, I don't know anything about Facebook, and I only have a few Facebook friends for my family." Turns out she was the administrator for 5 pro-cop Facebook pages, and the prosecution still let her on to be on the jury. Same thing with what we see with these jurors in this Chauvin trial. People that had family members that were cops, people whose friends were cops. They were let on the jury, but I'll never forget Juror 76. When Juror 76, an African-American man, talked about his experiences that were problematic with Minneapolis police, he talked about how the police drove through the neighborhood after a murder and, would play loud music, Another One Bites the Dust, and drive around the neighborhood. And when he talked about having those negative experiences with police, his lived experiences, even though he said, I can put all of that aside and I can judge this case based on the facts and the law, they would not allow him on the jury. But when these white jurors who said, well, my friend's a cop, but I can put that aside and make my decision on the facts and the law, they allowed them on. And so if the criteria for being on a jury, not being on a jury, is having lived experience with police brutality or bad policing, then you can tell right there what's going to happen to that jury. And so I'm very concerned about the jury selection. Otherwise, I think they've done a mostly pretty good job with the case. But all the prosecutors got to do, all the defense has got to do is get one juror to not vote for a conviction, and then we have no conviction. And really, I want to throw one more thing in. If we don't have a conviction in this case, all the media keep coming up to me, well, what's going to happen if we don't have a conviction in this case? Let me tell you what's going to happen. What's going to happen is it's going to unleash police violence on our community like we have never seen before, because it will give permission for these cops to do whatever the hell they want to do. Already, we still have that problem because just a week and a half ago, we had to have a press conference with these young people who got the tar beat out of them for no reason by the Minneapolis and Robbinsdale police, a nearby suburb. And, our cops are not behaving well. They don't seem like they have it in them to do it. Like you said, that Ben Crump said, you'd think they'd be on their best behavior. They don't have best behavior. They don't have that as a possibility, right? And so they're still doing all the stupid clownish things that they want to do. And I can answer some things about Klobuchar. I'd love to talk about that. I talk about it a lot in the media, but I don't want to be the one just running the whole conversation. So I'll shut up and give you guys some space, and then we can come back to that topic if you like.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Once again, sign up to our Socialist Action YouTube, subscribe, check us out at socialistaction.org, our website. And let's go to Lisa. What's your take on the jury selection question, the Klobuchar issue, the nature of the trial itself?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that the trial was going to be biased from the get-go. Our court system was not designed to work for working class people or poor people or people of color. It was definitely designed to work in favor of corporations and people who have power and privilege. And one thing that I was doing some research on the trial, and one thing that I found is that Derek Chauvin's his entire defense team, he doesn't just have Eric Nelson defending him. There are like 12 lawyers who are working in the background on his case, and that's all being paid for by the police union. It's being paid for by the police. They have a legal defense fund that police officers pay into during their career. So even though Derek Chauvin was fired as a police officer last year, he still gets to tap into that legal defense fund, and they're spending over $1 million on his defense. So there's a big bias right there. And like Michelle said, that I think there's a very long history of jury selection being incredibly biased. We can see that happening again here. So I think for me, the most surprising, most surprising part of this, I was actually surprised to see the police chief kind of throw Chauvin under the bus. Usually police tend to back each other up in the courtroom. And, I think maybe the protests and public opinion had something to do with that. They realized that people are angry and everyone's watching the trial. So I don't know, but that was kind of surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that to happen.
Yeah. A byproduct of this is that the term systemic racism became commonplace in the United States following the George Floyd murder. After a couple of hundred years after the Civil War, they decided to take down from the walls of Congress pictures of the Southern slavocracy, who have been honored and were honored to this day, not to mention their statues across the country. That is the slaveholding, secessionist, racist Southerners were given full credit for their role as American nation builders. And it took 20 million people in the streets to begin the process of taking down those statues, which is just incredible. But in Minneapolis, when I was reading the papers, I heard that the city council was virtually unanimous. Many people participated in picket lines at the mayor's office, and every councilman swore that they were going to introduce legislation that defunded the police. Michelle, Lisa, where does that stand today? Let's start with you, Michelle.
Well, I can tell you that they never meant it. Let's start with that. What they did was they basically jumped out there and said some things about dismantling and defunding the police and so forth. But what they really did was they put forward a city charter amendment, and our city charter is like our city's constitution. And so to change it, they have to put in an amendment. And right now, our police department reports to the mayor. And in fact, it's actually not the police chief that disciplines people, cops. It's the mayor that does it, but typically delegates it to the police chief. But it's under the purview of the mayor. What the city council wants to do is to move the police department under this Department of Public Safety, so that the police department would report to a commissioner that's over this department, that the department would then report to a city council committee, and then the council as a whole. So basically what they want to do is keep the cops, not make any real changes, but just bury them 3 levels down. And so this is not change, people. This is not change at all. And this is the thing that they've been pushing for. They wrote it so badly. The previous charter amendment that they came up with in the summer was written so badly that it got smacked down by the Charter Commission. But now this is what they're trying to do, is to, trot this mess out again with a few little tiny changes. But it's a mess. It doesn't do anything to actually change policing. And part of the reason our organization does not support it is that not only does it not change policing, but the city council has a really bad history. They have been the head of the Office of Police Conduct Review, which is like a fake version of civilian oversight that they've been overseeing for the last 8 years. And that office almost never upholds any complaints. They've taken in the last 8 years, 3,434 complaints. 20 have been disciplined. 20. That's a 0.58% discipline rate for complaints, when the national average for civilian oversight is 7 to 8%. And so we're like the low end outliers for disciplining cops, which tells you why a guy like Derek Chauvin can have 26 complaints and 4 lethal force incidents before he had his before he came upon George Floyd and murdered him. So, these are not the people that need to be overseeing the police. They've done an abysmal job of doing it. There's other changes that need to be made, but not the one that they're proposing. So it's really a problem that they even think they have any legitimacy in overseeing the police. Our organization doesn't support that at all. We do support right-sizing the police, which is like essentially, I would say, downsizing the police, redirecting those resources to other more appropriate responders as much as possible, like things like there should never be a police response to mental health crisis, drug overdoses, wellness checks, even traffic control. Minneapolis cops have a starting salary of $68,000 a year after 2 years of school. I'm not kidding about this. They come out of the academy making $68,000 a year, and we don't need to pay somebody $68,000 to wave their arms around in the streets to direct traffic. There's all kinds of other things cops don't need to be doing. So get them out of business of all of those things, and then rein the ones that are left, rein them in tight. So that's the proposal we support. But of course, the city council is not thinking about that reining them in tight part. So, that's really where things are at right now.
Socialist action supports the abolition of the police. That seems like such a utopian statement at this point, because most people, in fact, the majority surveyed in the polls, disagree. Because most people believe that you need some kind of force in the community to defend people against crime. So that's the argument for the police. My God, if there's no police, then the bad people are going to break down everybody's stores and steal everything. In the past, and I think the key to the answer to this question is, what can we replace the police with? We've heard this demand of community control, or more specifically, Black and Latino Native American control of their own communities. That is the idea, rather than racist police patrolling the streets and doing what they do, putting unprecedented percentages and numbers of poor people in prison to serve in the increasingly privatized prison industrial complex at near slave wages today. Why not have organized supporters, members, activists in the Black community choose their own representatives to patrol the streets against the racist police and to defend the interests of the oppressed? That seems to me a system that will emerge in the future, when the police are seen as the representatives of the capitalist state and its repressive apparatus, and the people are seen fully capable of controlling their own lives, their own communities, not to mention their own trade unions, not to mention their own governments, as opposed to the present government of the ruling rich. Lisa, am I off the wall in some of these assumptions? Michelle, let's start with you, Lisa.
Yeah, Jeff. Well, I think, if you look into the history of where the police force came from, the police force originally developed out of slave patrols in the 1700s. And so, they were developed to catch runaway slaves, control the slave population, return slaves to their owners, control riots and that kind of thing. And then there were also police forces that were developed like in the 1800s and some of the more like industrial areas. And a lot of their role was to control immigrant populations that were coming into the city to work in factories, and to control the workforce, the laborers, the working class. So that is the original purpose of the police force. And then throughout history, we see, then after slavery ended, then we see the police force upholding the Jim Crow laws in the South. And they were integral to that Jim Crow system. Then we see, the police, enforcing and perpetrating the war on drugs, which devastated poor communities and Black communities. Then we see, now the police their role is, upholding this mass incarceration system, this for-profit prison system, and not just Black and brown people, also immigrants. Dante Wright was killed because he had an air freshener hanging in the mirror of his car, and that's a common tactic that police also use in the immigrant community. They pull people over for a minor infraction, they book them into jail, and then they get deported, even if they have not committed any crime. So people say that police are here to protect and serve, but that's not their role. They're not here to protect and serve us, you and me. They're here to protect and serve the ruling class, the people in power, the people with the money, the system, the racist system. They're here to uphold that system that we live under. So if you think about that, it makes sense to call for the abolition of the police force. In my opinion, you can't reform them. As Michelle said, you know, they said, oh yeah, well, definitely we're going to defund the police. We're going to reform it here in Minneapolis. And then what happens? Basically nothing. They're just, you know, it just gets tied up in excuses and bureaucratic red tape. They just authorized $6.5 million just in February to hire dozens of new police officers in Minneapolis. So they're very far from defunding the police. So I think community control, you know, that's something that I saw happen in my neighborhood last year when George Floyd, after he was killed, and then we saw the rioting and things were burning and things like that. And the National Guard was rolling through my neighborhood with tanks, armored tanks. And so actually people in my neighborhood started going door to door, knocking on people's doors. Everyone got signed up on an app on their phones so we could all communicate with each other. They had nightly meetings at the park near my house. And then people took turns patrolling the alleys during the night to make sure that people in the neighborhood were safe, you know, and neighbors that I have lived in my neighborhood for a long time. And there were people in my neighborhood I'd never met before who started to organize, introduce themselves to each other, and support each other. So I think it's very possible.
Thanks, Lisa. Michelle, your take.
Yeah, well, I do agree with Lisa. I think that that ending policing as we know it is an aspirational goal. It's a good goal. Right now, the way that systems are set up, if somebody is a victim of a violent crime or financial exploitation or something like that, their avenue for accessing the court system is by way of a police investigation. So it's important that we do harm reduction right now as we work toward those other goals. In other words, this kind of thing of like, we're just going to end the cops right now would be problematic for the community. I live in North Minneapolis, which is largely people of color. And my neighbors are frightened of crime, frankly, and they're frightened of crime by police as well, you know, which, by the way, police brutality is a crime. And so, you know, they don't want to experience any of those things. And while, like I said, you know, at this time, the way the system's set up, it'd be a pretty hard thing to do. It's a great aspirational goal, and I think we should work our way there as we make the changes in the system that need to happen, you know, so that we can get there. But our organization supports community control of the police in the meantime. And so I want to be real clear about that. You got somebody on the that's asked a question about the police unions. And by the way, I don't call them police unions. I call them police federations because they aren't true unions, because they represent both management and line staff. And basically, and they're exempt from a lot of the sort of union rules, if you will, that the federal government requires of all other unions. And so we call them a federation, and they are really problematic, but they're not the only reason why we can't hold cops accountable. We've worked with a bunch of other organizations and spent about a year and a half looking hard at the Police Federation contract in Minneapolis. And actually, there's not that much in there that stops us from disciplining cops and things like that. We do have a list of 14 recommendations that we made to that contract. We've been fighting with the city to try to get those recommendations through. But, you know, things like requiring drug and steroid testing after a police critical incident, you know, a lot of things like that would be important to address police stuff. But at the same time, and getting rid of these ridiculous, you know, paid vacations that they get after they kill somebody, you know, some of this kind of stuff, right? But beyond that, there isn't that much to prevent police from being disciplined except the political will. We can't get our city to discipline these cops, because if they do, our city is self-indemnified, which means like we're self-insured for police misconduct complaints. It literally just comes right out of the tax dollars. We literally budget for police brutality in the city. So if they admit that one of their cops is doing something bad, if they actually discipline their cops, then that feeds to lawsuits. So they're scared to death. You know, they don't want to let it be known that their cop is a problem child. And so they don't discipline so that they can not have, so that it doesn't look like the guy's so bad for lawsuits and things like that. So this is kind of the way that this stuff has been done in this town. And so there's no political will. I do want to just tell your viewers one more thing real quick. Communities United Against Police Brutality has, I think, a pretty robust website. We have a course on there called Police Brutality 101 that looks at very strongly at the history of policing. There's a great piece in there because one of the other threads of policing is the Pinkertons, which were people that were union busters. And so this was their role and part of the history. All of policing history has been about protecting property for rich people and keeping unions and other organizing down to enable rich people to stay in the spots that they're in and hang on to the property that they've got and that sort of thing, and protect rich people. So read that information. It's a course that's called Police Brutality 101. I think it's very educational for people to understand the roots of policing that got us to this place, and then some ideas of what to do about it.
Thanks, Michelle. We're heading towards the last 10 minutes of our discussion. I want to urge people to subscribe to Socialist Action YouTube, to get in touch with us if you're interested in joining a revolutionary socialist organization, and to check out our website at socialistaction.org, or you can email us at socialistaction@lmi.net. Michelle, before we close, you're going to have to answer one question that our listener is dying to ask you. They want to know your take on Amy Klobuchar and her record of interaction with the police. We also have a question from Oakland, California, from Mark Roman, questioning whether or not police should be organized in the AFL-CIO, not to mention the AFL-CIO and affiliated unions. Our view is that we don't think cops need unions. It's like saying the slave masters, slave catchers should be unionized to protect their rights. So if they're unjustly accused of lynching blacks, for example, they should have a civil liberties defense. The trade union movement was built in opposition to scab herding police. The civil rights movement was built in opposition to the Bull Connor police departments that enforced segregation laws, not to mention slavery. So our view is that we don't support the unionization of the ruling class's brute murderers, cops, racist bigots who incarcerate untold numbers of poor and oppressed people. That's our take. But in any case, we have a final round approaching. We have about 9 minutes. Lisa, why don't you take the floor for your closing comments? Then we'll turn it over to Michelle, and we'll wrap up a very worthwhile evening. Lisa Leonard, you're up.
Yeah, so I think we've covered a lot of really good ground tonight. And thanks everyone who's joining us. And thanks, Michelle, for joining us too. We really appreciate you being here. We know that you're very busy, so your perspective has been great. I've learned a lot of little very interesting tidbits from Michelle that I didn't know, so I've taken notes tonight. So yeah, I think my takeaway with this whole discussion is just that we need to see police brutality as a systemic issue, that it's not just about Derek Chauvin or Kim Potter or any other police that have killed people over many, many years. Even if we convict Derek Chauvin, the system is still there. And that's what we need to focus on. We need to keep doing the work. We need to keep connecting with great organizations like Communities United Against Police Brutality, like Justice for Jamar, and other organizations in your area. We need to keep getting out there. We need to be in the streets, and we need to keep doing the work, keep working towards those goals and those ideals, and to dismantle the police system. It's just such an oppressive system, and it's never going to change unless people continue to do that work. So I'll end with that.
Michelle.
That is so right, Lisa. Thank you so much for that. I think we have a great example of community control of the police right there at George Floyd Square. It's been a beautiful example, which is one of the main reasons why the city keeps trying to dismantle it. It's going to be a bloody battle over that intersection because the city wants to take it back and the community wants to keep it. So we're, preparing for that situation. I think that they had at least enough sense to know not to do that until after the Chauvin trial is over. But we're gearing up to really have to deal with that situation. I know one of your listeners wants to know about Klobuchar. I want people to know that during Klobuchar's tenure as our our county attorney, 40 people were killed by police during that time period. She never prosecuted a single one. So, and she also was, during her tenure, the number of African Americans who went to state prison from the Twin Cities, from Hennepin County, increased by ninefold. So her record is atrocious. She put a young man named Mayan Burrell in prison who was provably innocent, and she put him in there on life in prison. It was completely outrageous. She's done this to a number of people. I'm working with several other cases now. And when she tried to hold her one and only rally here in the Twin Cities, as like a little suburb called St. Louis Park, we all went out there and protested it. And then when everybody started going into the meeting, a couple of us looked at each other and I said, why are we protesting outside the door? Let's go inside. We took over her rally. She was never able to even take the stage. This to me was a beautiful action. We had a huge number of protesters. We came in there, took over the stage, took over the whole rally, shut that rally down. And by the next morning, she was announcing that she was withdrawing from the presidential campaign. But, make no mistake, she has been involved in a lot of the kind of national stuff to bring a lot of attention to her. She's going to probably try to make another run for it, but we should not allow people with these kinds of records to be in any kind of power. She's talking about, I'm better now and all that. I don't want to hear it. You knew what you were doing then. That's nonsense. We're not having it. So I don't want to wrap up on her, though. I just want to say how much I appreciate this opportunity to speak. I'm happy to help anybody that's got any questions or anything. The work that we're doing is important because we not only work with cases on a day-to-day basis of police brutality, but we're also working to change the systems. And that's what I think is all of us are working together to do. And I think that's very important and where we need to be now. And so again, I thank you for the chance to be a part of this event tonight.
Thank you, Michelle and Lisa. We're honored to have you with us. I'll make a couple of closing remarks. We mentioned that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, an estimated 16, if not 26 million people mobilized in the streets in a movement that became known as the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement that challenged the systemic racism across the country. But just a short number of months later, any honest observer would say that that movement, Black Lives Matter movement, virtually disappeared into the electoral apparatus of the Democratic Party in the lead up to the 2020 elections in November. In fact, it turned out that the various component organizations, NGO funded, of Black Lives Matter ended up receiving $90 million from various corporate funders. And the so-called civil rights leaders like the NAACP, which refused to back Amy Klobuchar, by the way, because of the kind of record that Michelle cited, disappeared into the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden, a former supporter of the Southern Democratic racists who were a key component of the Democratic Party in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if not today, became the presidential candidate. Socialist Action doesn't support Democrats. In fact, I might add that I ran for president of the United States against Joe Biden. You might know that I lost that election, but I won that election in the sense of sparking in the minds of people the need for working people to build their own independent organizations, to control their own communities against police violence, to represent themselves in the political arena, to fight in the labor movement from a break with the Democratic Party, to build a new world where working people truly have the power. That's what socialist action is all about. So with that, we're out of time. I'd like to thank again profusely Michelle Gross, the president of the Communities United Against Police Brutality in Minnesota, for 34 plus years of consistent struggle on behalf of working people, the poor, and the oppressed. And Lisa Leonard, representing Socialist Action, who is our technical person. And apologies that we couldn't bring on Mel Reeves, who is scheduled to come, but up to his neck. He is the editor of the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder. He's a journalist and a longtime human rights activist. We'll have him again. Thanks to our technical staff. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Lisa, and good night from Socialist Action. Subscribe to our YouTube. Thanks.